I'll never forget the morning I walked into Henderson's farm equipment lot in April of 2019, my worn-out work boots crunching on the gravel as I approached the rows of gleaming machinery. At 24, I was the youngest of the Miller family farming operation, and my father and two older brothers had made it clear they thought I was nothing more than a dreamer with unrealistic ambitions. The old John Deere 4020 sat there like a beacon of hope among the newer, more expensive models. She wasn't pretty, faded green paint, some rust spots on the hood, and a seat that had seen better decades. But something about her spoke to me. The dealer, Mr. Henderson, noticed me circling the tractor for the third time that week. "She's got good bones, son," he said, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. "Rebuilt engine, new hydraulics, and she'll pull anything you can hitch to her. Previous owner took real good care of her." I'd been saving every penny from my part-time job at the grain elevator for 2 years, living in the farmhouse basement and eating most of my meals with the family. My father had made it clear that buying my own equipment was foolish when the family already owned 3 tractors. But I had different plans that involved proving I could outwork anyone on our land. The asking price was $18,500, and I had exactly $19,000 in my checking account. It represented everything I'd earned, saved, and sacrificed for. My brothers had laughed when I mentioned wanting to buy my own tractor, saying I was too green to handle the responsibility of maintaining equipment. Dad had been more direct. "Boy, you can't even keep your pickup running half the time." But standing there in the dealer lot, running my hand along the old tractor's steering wheel, I knew this was my chance to prove them all wrong. I wasn't just buying a machine, I was investing in my future and my reputation. This tractor would be the foundation of everything I planned to build. Chapter 2. The Purchase and the Ridicule. The paperwork took less than an hour, but the drive home felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. The old John Deere hummed along State Route 47 at a steady 35 miles per hour, drawing looks from other farmers who recognized both the tractor and the young fool driving it. I could practically hear their thoughts. "There goes the Miller boy with that old rust bucket." When I pulled into our farmyard, my brothers Jake and Tom were working on the newer family tractors near the machine shed. Jake, who was 31 and considered himself the heir apparent to the operation, stopped his wrench work and shook his head dramatically. Tom, 28 and always ready to follow Jake's lead, burst out laughing. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Jake called out. "Little brother's got himself a genuine antique. What do you pay for that museum piece?" I shut off the engine and climbed down, trying to project more confidence than I felt. The old seat had been comfortable enough during the drive, but I knew I'd need to replace it before putting in long days. The hydraulics seemed responsive, and the engine had run smooth and strong, but I could already see items on my mental maintenance list. Dad emerged from the barn, took one look at my purchase, and just shook his head. "Son, that tractor's older than you are. You could have put that money towards something sensible, like a down payment on a newer pickup truck." "She runs good, Dad. Henderson says the engine was just rebuilt, and she's got new hydraulics." Tom wiped his hands on a rag and walked around the tractor, pointing out every imperfection. "Look at this rust on the hood. And this tire's got less tread than my work boots. You're going to spend more fixing this thing than it's worth." But I'd done my research. The 4020 was legendary for its reliability and power. Sure, she needed some cosmetic work and probably some preventive maintenance, but the bones were solid. More importantly, she was mine. No more waiting for someone else to finish with the family equipment. No more being told I was too inexperienced to handle the important work. Chapter 3. Proving ground preparation. The first thing I did was move my tractor to the far corner of the machine shed, the spot that had been designated as my workspace since I was old enough to hold a wrench. I spent the next 3 weeks going over every system, replacing worn parts, and learning every bolt and bearing on the machine. This wasn't just maintenance, it was building a relationship. I replaced the old seat with a new suspension seat that cost me $400, money well spent for the long days ahead. The hydraulic fluid was clean, but I changed it anyway, along with all the filters. The engine oil was fresh, but I wanted to start with a baseline I could trust. Every belt, every hose, every connection got my attention. My brothers continued their commentary throughout this process. Jake would walk by and make remarks about polishing a turd, while Tom suggested I paint racing stripes on it to make it go faster. Dad maintained his skeptical silence, but I caught him looking over my work when he thought I wasn't watching. He might not have approved of the purchase, but he respected thorough preparation. The real test came when I started planning my approach to the upcoming planting season. Our family farm consisted of 200 acres of corn and soybeans spread across 3 different sections. Traditionally, the 3 family tractors worked in coordination, with Jake and Tom handling the primary planting while I followed behind with secondary operations using whatever equipment was available. But this year, I had my own game plan. I'd been studying soil conditions, weather patterns, and planting schedules for months. I knew exactly which fields would be ready first, which varieties would perform best in each location, and how to maximize efficiency with my single tractor. I wasn't just planning to keep up, I was planning to set the pace. The night before planting season began, I performed one final inspection of my tractor. Every fluid level was perfect, every grease fitting was serviced, and I'd even touched up some of the worst paint chips. She might not have been the prettiest machine in the shed, but she was ready for whatever I could throw at her. Chapter 4. Planting season begins. The alarm went off at 4:30 a.m. on the first day of planting season. I'd been awake for 20 minutes already, too excited and nervous to sleep. This was it, my chance to prove that determination and planning could overcome skepticism and outdated equipment. I'd prepared for this moment for months, and now it was time to put my money where my mouth was. I fired up the old John Deere in the pre-dawn darkness, her engine turning over smoothly and settling into the familiar rumble that had become music to my ears. The headlights cut through the morning mist as I headed toward the South 40, the field I'd chosen to start with because the soil conditions were perfect and the layout would allow for maximum efficiency. Jake and Tom were still getting their newer tractors ready when I began my first pass. They'd chosen to start with the field closest to the farmyard, the traditional approach that minimized transport time but didn't necessarily optimize planting conditions. I'd spent hours studying soil temperature and moisture data, and I knew my field was ready while theirs might need another day or two. The old planter I'd borrowed from a neighbor was 20 years old but well maintained. It wasn't fancy, but it would put seeds in the ground at the right depth and spacing. I'd calibrated it 3 times the night before, checking and rechecking every setting. There would be no excuses for poor performance due to equipment problems. By 7 a.m., I'd completed 8 rounds while my brothers were still dealing with a hydraulic leak on Jake's tractor. Dad arrived with coffee and breakfast sandwiches for everyone, and I could see him calculating my progress as he watched me work. The old John Deere was pulling the planter effortlessly, maintaining consistent speed and depth across the varying terrain. "Kid's moving pretty good with that antique," Dad mentioned to Jake, not knowing I could hear him over the radio. It was the first neutral comment he'd made about my tractor since I'd bought it. Chapter 5. Finding my rhythm. As the days progressed, I began to understand what separated good farmers from great ones. It wasn't just about having the newest equipment or the most acres. It was about efficiency, preparation, and the ability to make every hour count. My old tractor was teaching me lessons that no amount of classroom education could provide. I developed a rhythm that maximized both my machine's capabilities and my own endurance. The John Deere's fuel efficiency was actually better than the newer tractors, meaning fewer stops for refueling. Her simplicity meant fewer electronic systems to malfunction, and when something did need attention, I could diagnose and fix it myself without calling a technician. While my brothers dealt with computer glitches, sensor failures, and warranty issues on their modern equipment, I was accumulating hours in the field. When Jake's brand new planter developed a metering problem that required a dealer service call, I just kept planting. When Tom's tractor went into limp mode due to an emissions system fault, I gained another half-day advantage. My efficiency wasn't just about equipment reliability, it was about preparation and planning. I'd studied weather forecasts obsessively, planned my field sequences to minimize travel time, and prepared for every contingency I could imagine. When afternoon thunderstorms forced everyone else to wait, I was already moving to a different field that drained better. The neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Patterson, whose farm bordered ours to the east, commented to Dad that she'd never seen anyone work ground as consistently as I was doing. The guys at the grain elevator started asking about my old John Deere when I stopped for fuel. Word was getting around that the youngest miller was setting a pace that surprised everyone, but the real validation came from an unexpected source. Old Pete Morrison, who'd been farming longer than anyone in the county, stopped by one evening while I was servicing my tractor. He walked around the machine slowly, running his weathered hands over the fenders and engine hood. "Son," he said finally, "this here's a real tractor. They built these to work, not to impress anybody." Chapter 6. The competition intensifies. By the third week of planting season, what had started as family skepticism had evolved into genuine competition. Jake and Tom were no longer laughing about my equipment choice. They were working longer hours and pushing their newer tractors harder to keep pace with my progress. The dynamic of our family operation was shifting, and not everyone was comfortable with the change. I'd planted 340 acres, while Jake had covered 290 and Tom had managed 275. The numbers were posted on the kitchen whiteboard, where Mom tracked our daily progress, and the evidence was undeniable. My old tractor, the rust bucket they'd mocked, was outperforming machines that cost 3 times as much. The turning point came when Jake's transmission developed problems that would require major repairs. His fancy tractor would be down for at least a week, right in the middle of the optimal planting window. Dad asked if I could take over some of Jake's assigned acres, the first time anyone had suggested I was capable of handling additional responsibility. "I can cover his section and still finish mine on schedule," I told Dad. It was a bold statement, but I'd run the numbers. My equipment was proving more reliable, my field efficiency was better, and I still had capacity for longer days if needed. Tom looked skeptical. "That's another 200 acres, plus what you've got left. You really think that old tractor can handle that kind of workload?" "She's handled everything I've thrown at her so far." Jake wasn't happy about needing help, especially from his younger brother with the antique equipment, but he also knew that missing the planting window could cost thousands of dollars in yield potential. "Just don't screw up my seed rates," he muttered, handing over his field maps and planting specifications. That night I spent 3 hours planning routes and calculating timing. I would need to work 18-hour days for the next week, but it was doable. More importantly, it was my chance to prove that determination and smart work could overcome any equipment disadvantage. Chapter 7. The Marathon Week. The next 7 days tested everything I thought I knew about farming, equipment, and myself. I was running on 4 hours of sleep per night, sustained by determination and the knowledge that this was my defining moment. Every morning, I was in the field before sunrise, and I didn't shut down until well after dark. The old John Deere performed flawlessly. While modern tractors around the county were suffering from the stress of extended operation, overheating, computer glitches, and component failures, my simple, reliable machine just kept pulling. The air-cooled engine ran smooth and cool, the mechanical systems required minimal maintenance, and the straightforward controls never confused me, even when exhaustion was setting in. I developed a support routine that maximized field time. Mum started bringing meals to whatever field I was working, saving the hour it would take to drive home for lunch. I arranged for fuel delivery directly to the field, eliminating trips to the farm for refueling. Every detail was optimized for efficiency. The neighbors were definitely taking notice now. Cars would slow down on the county roads as people watched me work. The local coffee shop conversation had apparently shifted to speculation about whether the youngest miller could actually pull off his ambitious schedule. Some were betting against me, but others were starting to believe. Dad began making more frequent visits to check on my progress. His comments had evolved from skeptical to encouraging. "You're making good time today," he'd say, or "Field looks good behind you." He never directly admitted he'd been wrong about my capabilities, but the shift in his attitude was obvious. By Thursday of that marathon week, I was ahead of schedule, despite taking on Jake's additional acres. My planting quality was consistent, my equipment was running perfectly, and I was starting to believe I might actually accomplish something that would permanently change how my family viewed my contributions to the operation. The real test came Friday, when a weather front was predicted to move in over the weekend. I had 120 acres left to plant across 2 fields, and rain would put everything on hold for days. It was time to find out what my old tractor and I were really made of. Chapter 8. Breaking Point and Breakthrough. Friday dawned cloudy with increasing humidity, the kind of conditions that preceded significant weather changes in our part of Iowa. The forecast called for storms by evening, which meant I had perhaps 10 hours to finish what would normally be a day and a half of work. Everything would depend on equipment performance and my ability to maintain pace without making costly mistakes. I started in the dark at 5 a.m., using the tractor's lights to guide the first few passes until dawn provided better visibility. The old John Deere fired up instantly, as she had every morning for the past month. No computer systems to initialize, no emissions regeneration cycles to complete. Just turn the key and go to work. The morning progressed smoothly until around 10 a.m., when I noticed a slight hesitation in the engine under heavy load. For a moment, my heart rate spiked as I imagined major mechanical failure with 80 acres still to plant. But years of working with Dad on equipment maintenance paid off as I quickly diagnosed a partially clogged fuel filter. The repair took 20 minutes. Drain the filter bowl, clean the element, and get back to work. A modern tractor might have required a laptop computer and a dealer technician to clear error codes and restore full function. My simple mechanical system was back to full power as soon as I finished the cleaning. By 2 p.m., I was on my final field with 3 hours of work remaining and 4 hours until the predicted storms. The math was working in my favor, but I couldn't afford any more delays. I increased my speed slightly, pushing both myself and the equipment harder than I normally would. The old tractor responded beautifully, maintaining consistent depth and spacing even at the accelerated pace. Tom showed up around 4 p.m. to watch my progress. His own planting had been completed 2 days earlier, and he'd apparently come to see if I would actually finish before the weather hit. He didn't offer to help, but he also didn't make any jokes about my equipment. He just sat in his pickup truck and watched me work. As I completed the final rounds, I felt a sense of accomplishment that went far beyond just finishing the planting season. I'd proven something important to myself and to my family. With 1 hour to spare before the first raindrops fell, I planted my last seeds and headed home. Chapter 9. Recognition and Respect. The storm that hit Friday night was everything the forecast had predicted. 3 inches of rain over 12 hours, accompanied by wind and lightning that would have made fieldwork impossible. As I sat in the kitchen Saturday morning, drinking coffee, and listening to the rain on the roof, I reflected on what I'd accomplished over the past month. I had planted 540 acres in 4 weeks, including taking over Jake's responsibilities when his equipment failed. More importantly, I'd done it with quality work that met every specification for depth, spacing, and seed rate. The old John Deere had performed flawlessly, requiring only routine maintenance and that one fuel filter cleaning. Dad joined me in the kitchen, pouring his own coffee and settling into his usual chair at the table. For several minutes, we just listened to the rain and watched lightning illuminate the farmyard. Finally, he spoke up. "You did good work this spring, son. Better than I expected when you bought that old tractor." It wasn't a dramatic admission or an elaborate apology, but coming from Dad, it was significant recognition. He'd built his reputation on careful, quality farm work, and his approval meant more to me than any trophy or award could have. Jake emerged from his room around 8 a.m., still dealing with the frustration of his equipment problems and the reality that his younger brother had bailed him out. He poured coffee and joined us at the table, clearly wanting to say something, but struggling with the words. "Thanks for covering my acres," he finally managed. "You did a good job." Tom appeared a few minutes later, and the 4 of us sat around the kitchen table in the kind of companionable silence that often characterized farm families. The rain continued outside, but there was no urgency to be anywhere else. Planting was done, and it had been done well. Mom bustled in from the living room where she'd been tracking weather radar on her tablet. "Looks like this rain will continue through tomorrow. Good thing you boys finished when you did." She glanced at me with obvious pride. "Especially you, honey. I was worried you were pushing too hard, but you proved you knew what you were doing." Chapter 10. Summer Maintenance and Growth. The summer months provided time to properly maintain equipment and plan for harvest season. I spent considerable time servicing my John Deere, not because it needed extensive repairs, but because I wanted to understand every system completely. This wasn't just about keeping a machine running, it was about building expertise that would serve me throughout my farming career. I replaced the worn rear tires with new ones, invested in an LED light kit for better visibility during early morning and late evening work, and upgraded the radio system so I could stay in communication with the rest of the family operation. These improvements weren't cheap, but they were investments in efficiency and safety. The crops looked exceptional across all the fields, including the acres I'd planted. Dad and the local extension agent both commented on the consistent emergence and healthy plant stands throughout our operation. The old adage about good farming being 90% about timing was proving true. Getting the seeds in the ground during the optimal window had made all the difference. Jake's tractor had been repaired under warranty, but the experience had cost him confidence in the reliability of modern equipment. He started asking questions about my maintenance routine and seemed genuinely interested in the mechanical simplicity of older machines. "Sometimes I think we've made farming too complicated," he admitted one evening while we were working on his planter. Tom had begun researching used equipment himself, not because he needed another tractor, but because he was curious about the reliability and maintenance costs of different eras of farm machinery. Our conversations had evolved from skeptical teasing to genuine technical discussions about hydraulics, engines, and implement compatibility. The neighbors continued to comment positively about my work. Several older farmers made a point of mentioning how impressed they were with my initiative and work ethic. Mrs. Patterson hired me to plant her small grain plot, the first outside work I'd been offered since buying my own equipment. Word was spreading that the youngest miller was a serious farmer worthy of respect. Chapter 11. Harvest Preparation. As summer transitioned into early fall, attention turned to harvest preparation. This would be the final test of my planting quality and equipment reliability. Good planting meant good stands and uniform maturity, while reliable equipment meant being able to capitalize on optimal harvest conditions when they arrived. I spent August preparing my equipment and developing my harvest strategy. I'd purchased a used combine header and grain cart, expanding my capability to handle harvest operations independently. The financial commitment was significant, another $15,000 invested in my operation, but the potential returns were worth the risk. My harvest planning was even more detailed than my planting preparation had been. I analyzed historical weather patterns, studied grain market trends, and planned equipment sequences to maximize efficiency. I wouldn't just be keeping up during harvest, I intended to set the pace once again. The family dynamic had shifted noticeably over the summer. My opinions were now solicited during planning meetings, and my equipment was considered an integral part of the operation rather than an experiment. Dad had even suggested that we coordinate our harvest schedules to optimize the use of grain trucks and storage facilities. Jake and Tom had become more collaborative in their approach to family farm operations. The success of my spring planting had demonstrated that innovation and hard work could overcome equipment disadvantages, and they were both looking for ways to improve their own efficiency and effectiveness. The crops across all our fields were showing excellent potential. The corn was tall and healthy with well-developed ears, while the soybeans were setting heavy pod loads. Early yield estimates suggested this could be one of our best years in recent memory, validating the quality of everyone's work during the critical planting season. As September arrived and harvest season approached, I felt confident and prepared. My equipment was ready, my planning was complete, and my family's expectations had evolved from skeptical to supportive. The old John Deere that had been mocked as a rust bucket was now recognized as a reliable, capable machine operated by a farmer who had proven his worth. Chapter 12. Harvest Vindication. The first week of October brought perfect harvest conditions, dry weather, moderate temperatures, and enough wind to help finish drying the crops to optimal moisture levels. This was the moment I'd been working toward since that April morning when I'd bought my old tractor. Everything would depend on execution and equipment performance. I started in the same South 40 where I'd begun planting 6 months earlier. The corn was standing perfectly, with uniform height and maturity that reflected the quality of my spring work. As I engaged the header and began my first pass, the grain tank filled steadily with high-quality corn that tested at exactly the moisture level I'd predicted. My equipment coordination was flawless. The old John Deere pulled the grain cart effortlessly between the combine and the waiting trucks, while my planning ensured that transportation was always available when needed. I'd learned from my planting experience that logistics could be as important as field operation in determining overall efficiency. Jake and Tom were running their own operations in parallel, but without the competitive tension that had characterized planting season. We were working as a coordinated team, sharing resources and information to maximize everyone's productivity. My success had elevated the entire family operation rather than diminishing anyone else's contributions. By the end of the first week, I'd harvested 200 acres with yields that exceeded county averages by 15%. More importantly, my grain quality was exceptional: low moisture, minimal damage, and consistent test weights that commanded premium prices. The proof of good farming was in the grain tank, and my results spoke for themselves. Dad had started bragging about our family operation to neighbors and at the grain elevator. When asked about our success, he made sure to mention my contributions alongside Jake's and Tom's achievements. "The boys got good instincts," he'd say. "Sometimes old equipment in young hands works out better than new equipment in old hands." The local farm paper ran a feature story about our family operation, highlighting the combination of traditional farming values and innovative approaches that had produced exceptional results. My story about buying used equipment and outperforming newer machines became part of the article, demonstrating that success came from farmer skill rather than equipment age. Chapter 13: Legacy and Future. As I write this story 3 years later, that old John Deere 4020 is still the backbone of my farming operation. She's been joined by additional equipment as my operation has expanded, but she remains my primary tractor and the machine that taught me everything important about farming. The investment I made in 2019 has paid for itself many times over. My relationship with my family has been permanently transformed by the events of that first season. Jake and Tom now consider me an equal partner in the family operation, while Dad has begun discussing long-term succession plans that include all 3 of his sons. What started as a young man trying to prove himself has evolved into a true farming partnership. I've expanded my operation to include 300 acres of rented ground, purchased with the confidence that comes from proven success. The old tractor that my family once mocked now anchors a profitable farming enterprise that generates both income and respect. She's also become something of a local legend, recognized throughout the county as proof that determination matters more than expensive equipment. The lessons I learned during that first season continue to influence my approach to farming and life. Preparation matters more than equipment. Reliability beats sophistication. Hard work can overcome almost any disadvantage. These principles have served me well in farming and in other aspects of my life. Young farmers often ask me for advice about getting started in agriculture. I always tell them the same thing. Find good used equipment you can afford. Learn to maintain it yourself and be prepared to outwork everyone around you. Success comes from farmer skill, not from impressive machinery. That old John Deere taught me that farming isn't about having the newest equipment or the most acres. It's about understanding your land, your crops, and your equipment well enough to make them all work together efficiently. It's about taking responsibility for your own success and not making excuses when things get difficult. The tractor that my family laughed at when I bought it has become the foundation of my farming career and the source of my reputation in the agricultural community. She proved that sometimes the best investments are the ones that seem foolish to everyone else, but make perfect sense to you. I still get that same feeling of satisfaction when I fire up the old John Deere on a spring morning, knowing that we're going to accomplish something important together. She's not just a machine anymore, she's a partner in everything I've built and everything I plan to achieve. Thank you so much for listening to my story about proving everyone wrong with an old tractor and a lot of determination. I'd love to hear from all of you. Please write in the comments below and tell me what part of the world you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about hard work, perseverance, and the satisfaction that comes from proving your doubters wrong.